If you ever feel out of control around food, you're not alone, and you're in the right place to learn practical, no-nonsense information about why you binge and how to stop. Binge eating does not mean that something is wrong with you. It's a natural but primitive brain response that you can correct. If you're ready for change, sign up for the Brain Over Binge self-paced online course for less than $20 per month. And if you feel you need personalized support, we also offer one-on-one coaching and group coaching. To learn more, go to brainoverbinge.com/subscribe. And I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the Brain Over Binge podcast, where you learn a simple, brain-based approach to ending binge eating. I'm Katherine Hansen, your host, and I'm the author of Brain Over Binge and the Brain Over Binge Recovery Guide. My mission here on this podcast is just to share insights and ideas and strategies and resources that you can use as you overcome binge eating. I've been sharing stories of individuals who have overcome binging and purging in order to inspire you and to help you see that you're not alone and that recovery is possible. This is the third episode of the Recovery Stories, and if you have not listened to the previous two shows, I encourage you to do that because I think you will be able to resonate with them and that they will help spark new insights that you can use in your own journey. Today I'm sharing the conversations that I had with Laura, Federica, and Elspeth. They are all unique and struggled for different lengths of time and recovered on their own timeline as well. All of the conversations were amazing. It was so wonderful to get to know these three women and to see the changes that they've been able to make in their lives. I hope that you'll find them all very helpful and motivating as well. Thank you so much for joining me today, Laura. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, maybe we can just start by you telling me a little about your journey with an eating disorder and then kind of how you overcame it.
Yeah. So my story was similar to yours in the fact that, I was an athlete and kind of developed around the same time. So I was like 14 when I was first diagnosed. And then about a year after I was diagnosed with anorexia, I began binging. As I later find out, makes total sense to restriction, but at the time just felt completely out of control and just that fear set in. So then I began to purge through exercise and excessive running and ab routines and it got out of hand. I was exercising at night and very similar to your journey, like in the book where, okay, I binged today. So tomorrow we're going to the gym for like this many hours and just sneaking in all those workouts and getting that release, that sense of, okay, I've regained control. And then the binging got very out of hand whenever I entered my senior year of high school. And I was I couldn't keep up with purging anymore. And it was I was binging 6 to 7 days a week. And that's where I was absolutely at my lowest. And like a lot of people who struggle with binging, you just keep avoiding the foods because you think that you're out of control around the foods, not realizing that avoiding those foods is triggering those urges and being interpreted by the brain as, oh my gosh, there's not enough food in my environment. I'm going to produce more urges to binge. So yeah, I guess in a nutshell, for me, it was just years and years of restriction and binging. And some periods were heavier on the binging aspect. Some were heavier on the restriction, but it was just this cycle, this relentless, to the point that I began hating working out because it wasn't even anything enjoyable. It was just a way to try to attempt to work off the binges. So it took a long time, pretty much until I read your book and learned what was going on in my brain until I truly began to work in a recovery.
Yeah, our stories definitely sound very familiar. I can totally relate to the exercise just becoming something you dread. And exercise should be enjoyable. Exercise should be something that makes you feel good. And it was just, it's exhausting, absolutely exhausting.
And it was a punishment. It was something like we had to do.
Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to restricting, thinking that is a solution, thinking that that's helping in some way. And it's really just fueling the cycle. And when you can't step back and see that, it just perpetuates.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So when you read my book, was it kind of instant? What was it, a gradual process? I know you said you read my book and also the recovery guide and listened to my podcast as well.
Yes. So it was just like something clicked. So first of all, reading the introduction or the first chapter where we were discussing like you open with like discussing a binge. I was like, oh my gosh, someone else gets it. Because at this point, I had not read really anyone else's eating disorder like journey with bulimia. Like you hear, kind of the way the media portrays it, like the way they show eating disorders. I had seen that type of stuff and read it, but I had never felt so understood and like, oh my gosh, where was this book when I was in high school and really like in the depths? I started reading it after my relapse in grad school. And so it just like, absolutely. So I was like hooked at that point. It had never been explained to me, the inner workings of the brain and the concept of neuroplasticity and what's going on, like the higher brain and the lower brain, that cortex and the limbic system. So learning that was the most powerful, like empowering concept I had ever come across. And so as I began to implement those 5 concepts into my life, I began to see actual changes, because it wasn't like, sure, an aspect of recovery was having that support and, using coping skills and doing other things. But for me, it was the brain education that really changed everything.
Yeah. Just realizing that it's a habit, that it's coming from these primal brain centers. And no matter how much work you kind of do learning how to cope better and getting support and all that stuff, that's great. But if you're not addressing the habit, addressing those neuroplastic changes that need to be made, then nothing's really going to change.
Yes. And I became an advocate. Like I focused my research in grad school on eating disorders and the brain, and how so many treatments just don't address the brain. We're like trying to do all these other things, but then we're not addressing the core issue. Like you have control. Like I love, you mentioned something in the book, and I was marching around my apartment like, oh my gosh, I had control all along. You mentioned something about like, I can't control the thoughts and the urges that come up in my mind, but I can control whether I decide to walk to the kitchen or whether I decide to put the food like in my mouth. And I was like, I'd never thought of it that way. Like we make ourselves victims to our thoughts, and like, that's not the way it's supposed to be. That's not how we're created. And so that was like remarkably empowering, because I've never even considered that.
Yeah, I can relate to that too. Because when I read Jack Trimpey's book, Rational Recovery, it gave me that same feeling of, oh my gosh, I don't have to act on these thoughts that have sort of overrun me for so long.
Yeah.
And then something too is like the thoughts that we have, that we act on, that we feel powerless against. Not only do we feel powerless against them, but sort of in therapy, we're led to think that they are meaningful, that they're really symbolizing our deep inner pain. And so in that way, they become even more significant. Whereas, my book is kind of the opposite, that they're just junk.
Yes. It's so funny because toward the end of my grad school journey, as I was entering practicum and internship, I was, I'd been studying all these different counseling theories, because we had to choose a theoretical orientation. And, CBT is so mainstream, and there is a lot of evidence, based stuff with CBT and eating disorders, but I just knew that wasn't me. It didn't work for me. And so when I discovered by accident acceptance and commitment therapy, and what I loved about it is it lined up with your book and with what worked for me, because it has the concept of diffusion, which is where we detach from thoughts rather than trying to change thoughts or spending all this energy and, okay, this thought isn't true. It's just, you know what? I don't have to pay attention to the thought. Like I don't have to give it all of this energy, because neurons flock to whatever we give attention. So why are we giving attention to these unhelpful thoughts? Like, let's simply dismiss it and focus our energy on life and other useful things. So that and the mindfulness aspect and values-based living, like it fully lined up with what had worked for me and so many others. As I learned through your podcast and other materials, I was like, this is it. And it's just remarkable to witness that change in clients as they learn that they are in control and they don't have to be victims of their thought life.
It's amazing that you not only did this for yourself, but then you're going on to help others and apply what you've learned. Can we talk more about the work you do?
Yeah. So I'm a full-time counselor at Gibson Center for Behavioral Change here in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Oh, nice. And so we are a substance use treatment facility. Mm-hmm. And so this is so applicable, because eating disorders and substance use, self-harm, all of those behaviors, I have such a passion for those like maladaptive behaviors we kind of develop over time. And so the brain stuff, like even just yesterday, I had a client that was like, this is more helpful than anything I have ever learned in treatment. And all we did was we discussed the different parts of the brain and trauma responses. we deal with a lot of substance use, a lot of trauma, a lot of eating disorders here. And I always begin or at some point incorporate the concepts of the brain so that they realize what they're dealing with, because recovery is going to take so much longer if we don't first realize, like, you're not stuck this way forever. Like, we just have to kind of trick our brain. We have to, like, we're going to direct our thoughts. We're going to take control of our thought life and our behaviors through the neuroeducation piece. And so that is like the basis of everything I do. Like, everyone at the facility knows, they're like, Laura's the brain nerd. I have to incorporate my brain diagram into and you're the one that, it was your book, Reading Brain Over Binge, that initiated that. Like, yeah. I always say God led me that book at the right time, because I was just entering, it was the summer before grad school. Wow. And then that became the basis of all of my research and getting so into weight set point theory and how diets don't work. And yeah, I use that every single day in treatment as I'm treating others, and even in running my blog on the side. Like, that's the basis of everything.
I want to talk about the diet stuff because I think that's super important. But I just want to say, like, I think it's so amazing just looking back on when I first started writing the book and just the desire to help people, and then to see you go on and help so many people using these concepts and your own knowledge and your own expertise. It's just like mind blowing to me. And I told you before the call, like, it's just so meaningful. I just love it. So thank you for sharing that. And then the diet piece, I know that was really important to you, like, as far as realizing that the restriction was fueling the cycle. How did you sort of get yourself to start eating enough? Because I think that can be a big barrier for people.
Yes. Oh my goodness. And that was the thing that kept setting me back, because my binge eating did not end as quickly as yours or as a lot of others, because I just kept restricting my food. And even reading the Brain Over Binge recovery guide and, like, knowing the truth and reading all of this research and doing the research on knowing restriction doesn't work, it's still like, for me, restriction was always this sense of control. So the binging just kept happening. And so it became kind of this thing where it was hard, but I knew that I had to eat enough for the binging to end. And while I felt a lot of guilt and discomfort about eating more than usual or eating more regularly than usual, to me, it was like, I will face this guilt rather than the binge guilt, because that is the worst, most miserable physical and mental state that I could ever be in. And so I had to view it as like food is medicine. Like, I'm eating every 3 hours. I'm eating my structure, what worked for me. And it became this thing where even, throughout the rest of grad school, as I would struggle with binging, the next day I'd be like, okay, tomorrow we are eating some of our fear foods. And I would incorporate those. And sometimes when I'm dealing with people that struggle with binge eating and help them kind of realize, okay, how can we incorporate these fear foods in your plan? Or, okay, you binged on Little Debbie snack cakes tonight. How can we eat one tomorrow? They're like freak out. It's like, this is how we let the brain know that these things are okay to eat and that they're allowed and that we can have them anytime. And as I began to do that, my brain began to normalize all foods. Like, oh, we are allowed. That limbic system wasn't screaming for brownies any longer, or cake. Like, we only get it when we binge. It was like, I can have that anytime. Yeah. And so that was a very long process for me. I think just in my own personal situation, it took a long time, but every time I would binge, I was like, I'm not eating enough. How can I make sure I'm eating enough? Because it was like a red flag, like a wake up call. Like, I'm not eating enough. I'm restricting something, even if it's just mental restriction. That's still powerful. So
that is super powerful. And I think super inspiring to anyone else listening who is having trouble, because I think it can be just like I said, a mental barrier that you have to get past to realize that actually learning to eat these foods, actually eating enough, you end up eating less overall because you're not binging, binging on all these foods. Yeah. So it's just realizing that and finally, letting go of the idea that it's possible to restrict and still recover. I think a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to be the one who can restrict and still recover, but it's just not possible.
Yes. I'm such an advocate for binge eating disorder and love working with people who struggle with binging, because a lot of mainstream approaches and even like in the medical fields, they prescribe diets. And I was like, that is literally the cause. Like, that is, you look at anyone who struggles with binge eating and there is some sort of history of food restriction. And so I absolutely I lose it over these approaches that are literally like, okay, let's cut back the foods. And I'm like, oh my gosh, no, like you're part of the problem. You're worsening it. So yeah, the food freedom approach and anti-diet and like just intuitive eating.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's such a wonderful thing that you've been able to do that for yourself. You've been able to do that for others. I know, when I hear you talk about this and when I teach people about eating enough, there are some people who maybe feel like they need to avoid certain foods for a little while or something, or maybe feel like they don't have that control right away to start eating in moderation. So maybe like address that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So that's something in my own recovery, I really had to know, because there were times when it was like, I would end up binging after eating a fear food because I still hadn't, like, it was just too overwhelming for me. So I had to, I would get to the point. So say they like brought a cake to work for a birthday. Like I would check in with myself first. Like, okay, do I feel like I'm at a mental state right now where I can eat this cake and go on with my day? Or am I is that going to be too much for me? And I'm, because there are times where I could just feel like, okay, there's a lot going on. Like I'm feeling bingey today. I used to joke with my friends, I'm feeling bingey. And so I would check with myself in each and every situation. And then like your book talks about, the nutrition comes later, comes after. So I wanted to like normalize eating all the foods I needed. And then as my brain realized, okay, I can eat these fear foods. I can eat these binge foods anytime I want. So it kind of took away some of that, like, oh, I've got to eat it all right now. Then I got to kind of notice more, okay, how does my body feel? Like, I'm about to go for a run. I'd love a piece of cake. That's not going to serve my body well. So I'm going to have this snack now. And then, later, like probably after dinner, I'm going to have some cake.
Yeah.
So kind of learning that balance and learning to listen to my body. Because obviously when you try to take control of food for so long, then you become out of touch with your body's natural cues. So I kind of had to like really have that structure in the early part of recovery.
That makes a lot of sense. And just following what you feel ready for at the time. And it doesn't mean that everyone out there is going to be able to start eating their fear foods right away, but like learning to see them as safe, learning to realize that you do have control and just doing what works for you while making sure that you're eating enough. And then it evolves over time and you can make improvements over time and learn what works best for your body. So I think all of that about eating is super helpful. We talked some about what your life is like now as far as the work you do, but what about your life as far as your personal life and how recovery has just changed your life?
Yes. The first thing is, and you could probably relate to this, just the mental energy. Like, because before my mind was constantly focused on, okay, what am I eating today? What am I eating next? I'm just like counting everything and making sure. Or it's like, oh my gosh, I'm still dealing with this binge from yesterday. So how am I going to make it up? Am I going to be okay? Is my weight going to shift? It's like my brain energy was constantly, it's like 90% of it was going toward what I was eating and what I looked like. And it's like, oh my word. So now I have all of this energy for life. And then I'm more flexible now, because before it's like, oh my gosh, like friends are going out to dinner. I don't eat dinner at that time. I eat dinner at this time. And so like, I'm flexible now. I'm able to like actually fully engage in life. I'm like, oh, we're going out for ice cream in the middle of the day. Sounds like a blast. That's something that a few years ago would have completely like destroyed the rest of my day. And having the freedom to choose to overeat. And I think that's something you talk about in another recovery guide. The difference between like being a victim to overeating and then like choosing, like, okay, I'm at a buffet and we only get to come here ever so often to this, like my favorite Chinese buffet in town. So I'm going to have an extra plate, and then not feeling the urge to go home and binge. Because several years ago, that would have been, oh my gosh, this discomfort from this fullness. I'm going to go eat everything in the house when I get home. Now it's like, cool. I feel pleasantly like, it's fulfilling. So just completely different relationship with food and with life.
I love all of that. I mean, just the mental energy, the ability to be flexible, the ability to overeat and not feel guilty. It's so interesting because it's the least rational thing from a recovered person's perspective to eat a lot of food and then to go on to binge. But it seems to make so much sense when you're dealing with it. It's like, oh, I failed, so I might as well binge. But just encourage everyone out there that your mindset does change. Your whole perspective around food shifts. And I think you're just a living example of that. And I so appreciate you sharing.
And I always tell people, I'm like, trust me, I know this sounds bogus. I was like, I wouldn't believe it if I haven't lived it through. Like, it sounds crazy because when you are in that eating disorder mindset, you're like, what? you want me to eat these foods regularly? Are you kidding me? Or what? You choose to overeat and then you just don't eat when you get like, you don't restrict or binge the next day. How does this work?
Yeah. And it just all happens and it's incredible. And it just leads to so much of a better life. Is there anything else that you'd like to share or you want people to know just to sort of inspire them going forward?
Gosh, just that the concepts that you share and being able to separate ourselves from that urge, that is such a real thing. And it's so important. And it's applicable to any behavior. Like that's why I use it like every day at work. It's not even just eating disorders, like people with anger management, self-harm. All of these urges for maladaptive behaviors, like there's a space there. And if we only recognize the space, and that's what I like about your book is it teaches us how to recognize that space a little easier and even like, okay, I'm not going to react. Because I did notice when I would have urges, I'd get all stressed. And it's like, okay, I'm just going to keep a calm presence. And that sends a message to my fight or flight system that I'm chill. We don't have to act. And I'll never forget the first time that I truly used the concepts because I was about to go binge on a jar of peanut butter, which now seems like laughable because I eat peanut butter almost every day, like a normal serving for a snack. So I'm like, that just sounds gross and like crazy. But back then it was a fear food. And so I walked to the jar of peanut butter. I was getting ready to just like, go at it. And I was like, oh, I might as well practice those stupid principles I don't want to use right now because my animal brain's at the forefront, I'm like, oh. But I did. I was like, I'm going to give it a few minutes. And then like I completely felt the shift. And that was so empowering. And it was like that fueled my recovery every time I did that. And it didn't work every time. But every time I did that, it became fuel for recovery. Like, whoa, I can witness this shift. And then it's like the idea of binging on that seems laughable. Like, I can't believe I was just about to do that again. So just like being willing to recognize the power that you do have in changing your own relationship with food and just understanding that diets are not feasible. The diets of, restricting food groups and entire macronutrient groups. Of course, my bachelor's in dietetics and nutrition, so I could go on a whole rant about macronutrients and things. But I love, I have a thing on my wall that says proud diet culture dropout. And I encourage people to just, understand that diet culture is just employed.
Yeah. And just leads to more weight gain in the long run. Yeah, all that's so helpful. And I like the story about the peanut butter, I think it just shows you the power that you have once you step into your higher brain, and it may not be something you want to do in that moment, but if you can just step back for just a minute and feel that power, then binging just kind of eventually becomes something like you said, like, why did I ever do that? It just makes no sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
You did mention a blog and I thought people may want to read more. Do you want to share where that is?
Sure. So it's currently a Facebook page. So it was Laura Bauman, Food Freedom Advocate. And now it's Laura Bauman and it just has my credentials after it, EDS, LPC, NCC. And so I just share, there's a little bit about my own recovery journey there. And then just a few weekly posts about just diet culture and body inclusivity and eating intuitively. Of course, you'll see some posts about your book there. Read this book. But yeah, and that keeps me, it's good accountability for keeping my mindset focused on what works, because we have to do that with today's society being so infused in diet culture and normalizing unhealthy relationship with food and exercise. So I like that aspect of it, but it's also it is so fun for me to just like share what I've learned and I get excited when I'm typing up a new post. I'm like, woo! So
that's amazing. Well, your excitement is infectious. I love it. And I can link that in the show description as well, the page.
Okay,
so yeah, well, thank you so much. And I really appreciate you being here and sharing your story.
Yeah, thank you so much, Catherine. And thanks for all the work you do and the change you're doing in the community of eating disorders.
Thank you. All right. So Federica, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I really appreciated you sharing your story in Brain Over Binge in the second edition. I thought it was super inspiring. So today we're just going to kind of talk about it and, hopefully give some inspiration to anyone listening. When did your struggle with food start for you?
Well, I can't really pinpoint a time because I think I was in high school, so quite a few years ago. I think I was around 17, 18. And I remember that I became very obsessed about my food intake. I became very perfectionistic. At first, I believed I was like something healthy for me to do. Like I tracked all my calories, I weighed all my food. And yeah, so I lost a lot of weight over the years, but I never actually got diagnosed as anorexic, so I wouldn't use the term. But then I think it was around the first lockdown for COVID. It went from just restricting to restricting and binging in this cycle. And obviously it was very painful. So that was the reason why I actually started seeking help, because I didn't really try to seek help before when I was just restricting. So that's what happened pretty much.
Yeah. Did you seek help through traditional therapy? Like what sort of forms of help did you find?
Yeah, I tried with traditional therapy and but it didn't really work. I mean, I don't want to say that my therapist was bad or anything, because she was a very nice lady. She was very sweet. But I remember that she made me use this, I think, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy approach. And I remember that she asked me to write down every food I would eat and then just explain all my feelings about how I felt when I ate the food. And it was very stressful for me because I remember overthinking everything I ate, and it was very stressful. And it didn't work because I remember being stuck in this cycle where I ate well for a few days, then I restricted and I binged again. So
yeah, I can totally relate to that. I'm sure a lot of people can too. About you sort of start overthinking your eating when you start writing everything down and analyzing it. And like you, I never want to say that therapy is bad. You know, it does serve a purpose for people for sure, but it's not really directly targeting your habit. It didn't seem like.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of lost hope because I was like, no, this is not working. So I stopped going. And basically, I was just looking up things on the internet. I was like, let me see if I can find anything. That was pretty hopeless. And then I found the website, the course. And at first, I was quite hopeless. I mean, I didn't think it would help me, but I was like, I might as well try. And yeah, I mean, it was pretty much life changing for me because all my questions that I remember my therapist could not answer, you basically address them in the audios, in the lessons. So it was very useful, very helpful. Yeah.
Something I found inspiring about you is that you seem to really dedicate yourself to recovery. You said, I guess you were going through a time like academically when you had a lot of pressure and you still made time for the course every day. And
yeah, I remember like my approach to the course was do something every day, just like a worksheet or 10 minutes of a lesson, just split up and do the lesson over the course of a few days. But every day I took the time, even at night or just in the morning while, showering. I mean, I just tried to make time for it. And it depended on the days, because I noticed that some days maybe I needed more reinforcement when it came to the concepts of the course. And when I felt like I was struggling more, maybe with perfectionism surrounding food or just urges, I remember putting more effort, more time into the course. But yeah, generally every day I did something.
Yeah. Was it sort of gradual that the binging stopped, or did it kind of stop right away once you got into the material and realized that you had control?
I think it was pretty much, it stopped pretty much right away because I remember like having, I think 1 or 2 binges after the first few lessons. But then the concepts were very clear to me right away, and they made so much sense to me. I feel like in my mind, I already knew all the concepts, but hearing someone else discuss them and kind of validate them, I felt like it finally clicked for me, and it made so much sense. And I didn't need too much time to stop binging. I mean, it felt great when I finally felt like empowered to stop. And yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, congratulate you for making that happen in your life. And I'm glad that things I shared could be part of your journey toward freeing yourself from this. Something I want to ask is like, what was the most helpful thing to you, if you can remember, as far as like when you're going through the course? Was there a certain insight that you had? Was there something that really made everything click for you?
I mean, I think the part which I struggled the most with was black and white thinking surrounding food. And I remember an idea that really stuck with me was, no, I don't remember specifically which lesson it was, but basically you said that there is no point in actually binging if you eat in a way that maybe you don't consider to be perfect. Mm-hmm. And I remember this metaphor of the parking lot. If you back into a car, you would never back, the other cars in the parking lot.
Yeah.
So they really stuck with me. And every time that I had this kind of black and white thinking pattern, I would just think, okay, I would never back into all the cars in the parking lot if I backed into one. So yeah.
It makes a lot of sense, because that's such a common mindset to think, oh, I've already failed, so I might as well keep going. I might as well eat everything in the house, when really that's what's going to cause the harm, not the original thing that you ate that you think maybe was not perfect. That's awesome. And it sounds like sort of giving up the black and white thinking, giving up perfectionism around eating was really important to you. In the story you shared in Brain Over Binge, one of the things you said was that you were scared of taking that leap of faith and giving up restricting. And I think that listeners would find it helpful if you kind of explained how your mindset was, as far as how did you talk yourself into giving up restricting? Like, how were you able to eat adequately every day and not return to dieting?
Yeah, I was very scared at first, because I thought if I stop the restriction part, maybe I will keep binging and I will just gain weight. And I was obviously very afraid of that, because to me, that was like the worst thing that could happen. And that didn't happen, because the problem didn't exist, because as I said, I stopped binging right away, which was amazing. I think the leap of faith was definitely like so important to me, because it kind of reestablished my relationship with food. And I started seeing food as something that I needed to recover. I needed to have a healthy relationship with. I feared gaining weight, which I think is very common in recovery. But I remember really holding on to the thing you said about the fact that, weight kind of restores itself naturally when you stop binging, obviously, because even if you eat normally, that will never be as harmful to your body as a binge. Mm-hmm. So I really held on to the idea, and some days that it was very difficult to even eat normally, but I tried, and in the end it worked out pretty fine. So
yeah, I think that's great, just to remind yourself that eating normally, like, you'll think, oh, I can diet and that's going to be healthier or something, but that just leads to binging, and that's so unhealthy, and so is the restriction. So I think, it's just realizing that normal eating is so much healthier for your body. It allows your weight to regulate naturally. Yeah, I think all that's super helpful. I guess what I'd like to ask about is, how long has it been since you stopped binging? Has it been over a year, you said?
Yeah, I think I stopped. I think it was January 2021. Yeah, I stopped in basically December, at the end of December 2020, because I remember finding the website. It was like the 20th of December. And I think I had my last binge like a few days later, and then I stopped completely. So that was very successful.
Yeah, that's amazing. It is. It's absolutely amazing. And I guess I just want to ask, how is your life better now? What has changed for you since you were able to give up this habit?
Yeah, everything has improved. Obviously, my life is imperfect, as you often said also in the course. But I don't feel the shame surrounding food anymore. I can go out with my friends and just enjoy a meal with them without having to think I have to restrict after this. And then, I already binged, so I can go eat with them. So definitely also my relationships with people have improved, because food is such a big part of everyone's lives, and, it's something that brings people together. But in general, I just feel better, more energized. I don't overthink eating, and I have the time to do the things which I didn't have the time to do back then, because sometimes I spent like the whole day just feeling bad after a binge or something like that. So, everything definitely has improved. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Like you said, it doesn't mean life is perfect, but you just get to live as your authentic self. You get to do the things you want to do and not have that, constant pain and struggle. So that's amazing. Just for people who are out there listening and, are still struggling with this, do you have any final thoughts for them? Anything that you want them to keep in mind so they can overcome their own struggle?
Well, yeah, I'd say that in general, if they look at the fact that so many people have managed to overcome this problem, they can definitely overcome it as well. Because, it's a common experience, but if someone can get better, it means you can get better as well. So yeah, that's something to remember.
Yeah, thank you. That's very encouraging. And I just really appreciate you coming on today and sharing your journey with everyone. And thank you so much, Federica. Thank you so much, Elspeth, for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I was very thankful that you also shared your recovery story in the Brain Over Binge second edition. It was just very inspiring. And we're just going to kind of talk about that today. And hopefully it will also help the listeners.
Thank you.
It seems like your eating issues started at a younger age. Can you talk about sort of how it all began?
Yeah, I was reflecting back on this actually, and I was listening to Julie's story, which I loved recently too on a podcast, and trying to think of when it started. And I don't know that I have in my mind. I know she was kind of age 11 was quite pivotal, and some people have a specific age. For me, it was more so, I think I had sort of, abnormalities with food. It wasn't really until my 20s, 30s and 40s that I really entered into probably what I realized was disordered eating. So actually quite late, I guess, compared to some in life. So probably my 20s to answer your question.
It seems like, at least from what you shared in the book, there was sort of an attraction to food, maybe in childhood, but it wasn't until the dieting started really that the disordered eating took off. So you started dieting around in your 20s?
Yeah, that's right. And it probably is a pattern that you see. And I know when you had a sort of weight loss with your tonsillitis, I think was your story. And that was perhaps the start for you, maybe. It was similar to me, but not with any kind of dramatic event like that. It was more that I started to lose weight. In actual fact, I started running in my 20s, and then I lost weight. And then you do get that kind of positive affirmation and all of the comments, and I guess that was the start of that awareness of it, and the kind of, got me hooked in, if you like. So it was partly the habit formation of exercise, which was a positive thing for me. It was never to the extreme, but I guess it was the validation of the weight loss that started the complex food relationship in my 20s. Yeah, so I probably was never terribly underweight, although I was always striving for a body ideal that wasn't comfortable in my body. It was obviously much lower than my body wanted to be. So it was unhealthy in that sense.
Did the binging start pretty soon after the dieting, or did that come later?
Well, interestingly, it came later in my own body reaction, but it came earlier as a learned behaviour, because actually my older sister was grappling with, she actually was diagnosed with anorexia, and then it became bulimia. Mm-hmm. And I was living with her at the time, and it was more the kind of emotional support that I was giving her. And that played out in my own kind of binging to console her, which sounds strange perhaps, but just living with her at the time and her struggling with that, I kind of joined in, if you like, which sounds silly now. I look back on it and think I was trying different strategies, I guess, to try and help her through her struggles. So I found myself binge eating. I both witnessed it in its full form and also participated in it to a certain extent. So I wonder if I kind of learnt that behaviour to a certain extent. So there was that period of my life, but then later when I was exercising more and trying to live, an idealistic weight that was not healthy, that's when I actually found myself going into more of those overeating or binge eating patterns as more of a physiological response.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like people get into this in so many different ways. And I think that's why it's helpful to hear, so many people's stories because no one arrives at this habit in the same way, but a habit still forms. Sort of when you were at maybe your worst or the struggle was the greatest, how was this affecting your life?
Yeah, this was when it was kind of a physiological response to undereating. So I obviously wasn't eating adequately, and I'd kind of sustained that in a really rigid, it was all tied up in a kind of working hard, very disciplined during the week. So I had a kind of a pretty stressful job and was often traveling for work. So in my 20s, would spend the week working really hard, basically hardly eating, exercising a lot. And then the weekends, because we were living in the UK at the time, it was kind of just everything would let go. And of course, the body would kick in and think you're ravenous. So I would, kind of go into these sort of binge weekends almost where I'd be out and about with friends and in a social setting. And then it would just end in binging as well, from the food perspective and alcohol too almost. So it was kind of partly a lifestyle thing, like the weeks were really hard, disciplined, focused and deprived, and then the weekends were really excessive. And it just probably went on week after week after week, and I'd sort of get to the gym Monday morning and weigh myself, and it probably was only a difference of maybe 3 or 4 kilos that I would lose and gain the same kilos each week, which is so interesting when you look back on it. It probably went on for quite some months and even years, actually, that similar pattern. Yeah, so that's interesting, isn't it? When you sort of live with an unrealistic ideal of what you should be, and I guess it comes to all of the pressures that we grow up with in society, and it's hard to pinpoint where it comes from. But I see it all around me. This pressure to kind of, and you talk about it a lot in your work, of course, that we all feel it still, which really is so damaging, this pressure to be and look a certain way. And for me, it was probably only maybe 4 or 5 kilos lighter than I naturally am. And yet it almost ruined me, that number on the scale that I was forever chasing. And I'd get into a pattern of weighing myself on a Monday and being disappointed. And then by Friday, I might have met that ideal. But then, of course, the body responded over the weekend, and then it all just comes back. And I wonder why I couldn't let myself recognize the struggle and I guess, what my body was asking for. It's interesting that one can deny that for so long and it can be so damaging.
Yeah, I mean, just that chase of like the unrealistic body, it's just a losing battle. It's something that when you're caught up in it, it can feel like, okay, this is what I have to do. But, once you step back and you're like, wow, if I just would have left my body alone, I could have been so much healthier and I could have been able to focus on other things. So I guess my question would be, how were you able to start to see that and start to see that it was a losing battle?
It's interesting, isn't it? It's almost not a cognitive process, because you're right. If you're rationally thinking about it, you'd be saying, this just does not make sense. Why are you doing this? The change for me came with having kids in my 30s. I had a really beautiful phase where I realized all of a sudden that I had this absolute appreciation of the body and that all that it knows what to do. And I just let myself kind of celebrate and enjoy that natural sort of state of being pregnant, and because I struggled to get pregnant, possibly because of these habits. So by the time I did, I was so overjoyed and so full of gratitude, and let myself enjoy that and relish that. And then for even the following years, I have had 3 children, which is wonderful. And each time I'm so grateful for the body knowing what it needs to do and just letting it happen. So I did have a spell of probably 6 years where I was just in a really good place, just happy with the natural state of things, whatever that looked like. And it probably wasn't till after, quite some years after sort of childbirth and things, that I did kind of lapse back into old patterns once I was through those child rearing years and the early kind of manic years. Mm-hmm. For some reason, I think I started getting back into running again, and then maybe got back into what was deemed, a good shape in inverted commas. I think that's then what started it again for me. But by then, a few years later, when my daughter became a teen, I could see her observing so closely, and I thought, this is just time to end this cycle. I just have to, for the sake of her, try and behave, in a way that I would want her to see and learn from, and to change the behaviour. So actually, it wasn't until relatively recently, probably 2 years ago, that I came across your work. And for me, it all just fell into place. It was just like these beautiful bells ringing, just realising that firstly, I wasn't the only one who was struggling. It's just really quite common, and all of that you spoke about I could relate to and just resonated. And then I started the work in trying to change my behaviours and habits.
Yeah, I found that really inspiring about your story, is like that your daughter motivated you to change. I have 2 daughters myself, and I can relate to that. It's you want the next generation not to get stuck in this habits. You don't want to pass that along. And it's hard because there is such pressure on young women and young people to look a certain way. And you wanted to set a good example. I just think that's really inspiring. So as far as, like you mentioned, you started doing the work, what did that look like for you? Was it a lot of, just making sure you were eating enough? How did your recovery play out for you?
Yeah, so it started with your podcast, which I love. I sort of was falling into podcasts at that time, so listened to a few of yours, and everything I was hearing was so reassuring and kind of nourishing and just validating. So that gave me the motivation and the clarity that I needed to see what was happening and what needed to change. And then I just made a commitment, to make that change, as I said, partly for myself, but more so just because of my daughter. And I just didn't want her to witness anymore, because it was such a formative age for her. So, and she was kind of commenting on my weird neuroses and, strange eating patterns. So I could see that, what children are like. They watch so closely. So at that point, I heard about your course. And so I signed up to that one. And at the time, I was driving to work. So I had a sort of 30-minute commute. And I must be quite an auditory learner. I've come to realise I just almost need to hear the lessons and then hear them again and hear them again. So just really enjoyed working my way through the course, mainly listening to the audio. In fact, I confess, I don't think I did any of the worksheets, partly just it was practical for me to do it all through listening. And occasionally I'd sort of, when I was by myself, I'd write notes to reinforce it, but basically just really enjoyed listening, and I'd repeat lessons and take more in each time. So it probably took, well, I think I subscribed for well over a year and loved just going through each lesson by lesson, and then sometimes going back and repeating them. And so that really worked for me. I mean, I must say it did take quite some months before I saw things start to shift. And I also did seek out some extra help in the eating adequately part, because my work provided nutrition support. So I met this wonderful nutritionist who helped. I think even for a woman in her 40s, it's interesting to think I'd kind of forgotten how to eat, and I genuinely did not know the science, in terms of my height, weight, amount of activity. I kind of needed somebody to do the maths for me to say, this is what a normal person would be eating. And she was quite helpful in saying, actually, it's not enough of this, or it's too much of that, and just to try and help me get a balanced diet, essentially, and also to help make sure that the family was getting the right nutrition, etc. So to answer your question in summary, what worked for me was the course, the audio course, as well as a nutrition support. It was a really good blend.
Yeah, definitely. The eating adequately part is so important. And I'm not a nutritionist. And although the course gives some options and there's a lot of information about how to implement what works for you in your own life, like it's very helpful to seek out that outside nutritional support if you need it, especially like as you're healing your body and as, you hadn't eaten normally in a long time, and to get that extra help, I think is great.
Yep.
What about the dismissing urges part? As we're talking about the course, like half of it is regarding dismissing urges and half of it is primarily about eating adequately. Did you find the dismissing urges challenging? Like, were there times that you kind of slipped back into the binging or overeating, or was it more of like a sudden stop?
Yeah, I'm more of the former than the latter. So what I find really helpful, and I do go back to your podcasts, and I find I need to refresh my brain. It's almost as if it's, a muscle that I'm strengthening. So when I listen to your teaching and really focus on it, then when the urges come, I can do that disassociation and dismiss them. Sometimes I do, overeat, I guess, but I haven't had any full-blown binges for a long time. So, yeah, I've been really happy and really well for probably a good year now. But I do find myself almost drifting back if I haven't listened for, whether it might be a month or two, if I haven't listened to a podcast or read a chapter from your book. It's almost like the habits start to creep in a bit. But then I find I just tune in again to some of those messages, and then I can kind of strengthen the muscle again, if you like. It's that disassociation that I find quite hard, but it's also thinking of your future self. I know you talk about that a bit as well, and think of, Elspeth tomorrow, what will it feel like? I find that helpful. So I guess to answer your question, it wasn't sudden. It's been very gradual, and probably I'll stay close to your work for a long time, I think, because each time I almost hear something different and learn something different. I think maybe it's because it's decades. For me, it's like 3 decades of habit formation. Maybe it takes longer to kind of unravel that. So I think I'll probably keep tuning in for a long time.
Yeah. I love that you're just doing what you feel like you need. And it's not like if the urges come up or you find yourself kind of being pulled back toward the old habit, you don't say, oh, something's wrong with me, I'll never overcome this. You just think, okay, I need to reinforce what I've learned. I need to keep building the new pathways. I need to keep deconditioning the old ones. I do think that, yes, it does take longer when you've had the habit longer for this to be deconditioned. So I really think that's inspiring for people to hear that. If, let's say, a year down the road, you have an urge or you have a desire to restrict, it doesn't mean you're destined to go back in that behavior. It just means your brain is, remembering some old pathways, but you don't have to follow them. Yeah,
that's exactly it. And it's not having any emotion attached to it that's helpful, I think, is it thinking of in your terms that you describe of the brain pathways. To think of it more scientifically, I find very refreshing because it's not none of that self-judgment by any means. It's purely, a physical response, really, isn't it?
That's great. Do you feel like the urges have gotten less and less and it's become easier to maintain over time?
Oh, definitely. Yes. I would say I'm in a really happy place and it's comfortable. And I wouldn't say I have disordered eating at all now. I'm pretty completely normal. But it's more that I can sense a creeping up of something. It's hard to describe that urge almost in the back of my mind or something. So it doesn't ever really take over like it used to, of course. It's more just that I need to keep strengthening those new pathways.
Yeah. So I have a couple more questions. The first thing was, you mentioned you were really attached to like a body that was unrealistic. Can you talk about what that journey was like for you to sort of accept your body, how it naturally is?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there were periods post-childbirth when that happened naturally. And I think it was tied up in, I guess, the hormonal shifts and the appreciation of having kids. So that was a really wonderful phase. But then, as I mentioned, again, in my 30s, I seemed to sort of lapse back. So really it wasn't until I started working in your work, and maybe it's an age thing, like I'm 49 now. I just reached a point, and also with my daughter as well, I was trying to help her understand that, whatever she is just magnificent, and that I just didn't want her mind to be so consumed in the way that mine was for all those years. I mean, goodness knows what I could have done with all that brain power that I lost for so many years thinking about the ideal and the regret of not being like that. And it just seemed like such a waste of time and headspace. So I think I just reached a point, maybe it's age and maturity, but it's also your teaching, that it's just understanding the cost, I guess, the price that you pay for trying to be that ridiculous ideal. And then it's also, if you just let yourself, I mean, you're so right in your teaching, because you do find that beautiful set point, whatever it is, it just seems to go there. And now, even recently, I lost weight because I was sick and various reasons, a couple of kilos came off, and I kind of thought, maybe this is nice, but I didn't let myself go down there. And then naturally, within a couple of weeks, I'm back at that beautiful set point. So I think you're right. You just have to trust that your body will find that point if you let it, and it can take some time. But I just do all the things that you said in terms of allowing that to happen and then appreciating it, buying beautiful clothes that are suited to that size rather than trying to get into those ridiculous jeans that are at the back of the cupboard. Just get rid of them. So all of that has been refreshing. Again, I think the motivation has been my daughter and the skill born out through your teaching. So those messages are just so right. I think if you can just allow yourself to find that weight, whether it takes weeks or months, I'm sure everybody finds it eventually, don't they?
Absolutely. And then you get all of that brain space back. You get all of that mental energy, physical energy. I think everyone comes to that point in different timelines as far as realizing, okay, whatever benefits I might get from being in a certain body or whatever benefits I think I'm going to get is just not worth all the cost, like you said.
Yep, so true.
So yeah, this has been super helpful. Elspeth, I really appreciate you, coming on the show. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share with people who are still in that struggle?
I think, I'd just love to thank you. I think the work that you've done is incredible. It's so rich and complex and yet digestible and simple at the same time. So I'm just really grateful for all that you've done. And I know that you're helping a lot of people, and it really is a joyful learning, although it is work, so to speak. It's such a pleasure. And it's so important. I guess that's the other thing, isn't it? For all of our future generations, we really need to correct this because, I guess there's more that we could be doing potentially at a societal level to try and shift the thinking and increase the acceptance of our bodies. And your work, has just done so much for that. So, thank you very much. It's been wonderful, and I know we'll keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you. That all means a lot to me, and just it's amazing to hear. But I also want to congratulate you because you did the work. It sounds like you were just very determined to make this happen for yourself and to get free of this. And you listened to the course every day, and you sought extra help through the nutritionist, and you just made it all work for you. And I think that's super helpful for people to hear that you can implement this if you stay determined, if you stay focused, if you want this, you can totally be free of binging.
Yeah, so true. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much again to Laura, Federica, and Elspeth for talking to me and for sharing your story with all of the listeners. Federica and Elspeth had mentioned the course during their conversations, which, as they talked about, can be a valuable resource for reinforcing concepts and ensuring that you keep rewiring your brain day after day. And I always keep the course very affordable. You can simply purchase the course to have it with no expiration, or you can subscribe on a monthly basis for as long as you need it. All of the information for that is at brainoverbinge.com/subscribe. And there's also a link in the show description. And if you're someone who needs more guidance and support as you recover, you can sign up for group coaching or one-on-one coaching. And with group coaching, you actually get the course as well, so you can have that personalized guidance and support through the group's calls and the forum, while also having the course resources to use whenever you need them. You can find a link to learn about group coaching in the show description. It's brainoverbinge.com/group, and there is a link there to learn about one-on-one coaching as well. And just so you know, the group coaching and the one-on-one coaching is done by our amazing Brain Over Binge coach, Julie Mann. And in the summer, she actually has extra hours for the one-on-one coaching. So if you're someone who wanted to sign up for one-on-one coaching but was not able to find a spot, just know that there are now new spots that have opened up on her calendar. And I hope you can find one that works for you. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm so happy to be able to share these incredible success stories, and I know that you can also create one for yourself. And as always, I want to encourage you and remind you that you have the power to change your brain and live a binge-free life. The Brain Over Binge podcast is produced and recorded by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC. All work is copyrighted by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC, and all rights are reserved. As a disclaimer, the hosts of the Brain Over Binge podcast are not professional counselors or licensed healthcare providers, and this podcast is not a substitute for medical advice or any form of professional therapy. Eating disorders can have serious health consequences, and you are strongly advised to seek medical attention for matters relating to your health. Please get help when you need it, and good luck on your journey. Need more help? You can find all of our current and upcoming options for support at brainoverbinge.com.